I am muted. I was talking that whole time and I was muted. That's silly. Okay. To go back and to say what I was saying beforehand, um, what I wanted to talk about tonight is I wanted to talk about some perspective things because every time that I would encounter students and even on Skool in messages as well as on social media, something that is a common theme is people say that perspective is something that they struggle with. And even when I would talk to my students as they got into my class, they were at a 300 level. So there's some assumptions of things that you have and have not learned. And one of them would be perspective. And so we would always, go into that and I would say, "How do you feel about perspective? Are you comfortable with it?" And they would always say, "Oh yeah, I'm comfortable with it." Well, what I found out is that they were comfortable with like the idea of it and they knew sort of the principles, but not the execution. And that was always something that we had to address and we had to talk about. And so um, I wanted to go ahead and just do a little bit of perspective, just talk about it, talk about some of its uses, some ways to think about it, and just some cool things that you can do with it and understand that it's more than just measuring buildings. I feel like that's something that we tend to associate it with, and it's more than that. So, in just talking about perspective. Yay. So with perspective, there are there are 5 points of perspective. There's 1 point through 5 point. The most common that you're going to be using is obviously 1 point, 2 point, and 3 point. And by point, we mean our vanishing points. So a 1 point, 2 point, and our 3 point. So our 1 point is obviously that. Our 2 point, 2 points along a horizon, and our 3 point are on the horizon. And then you have another either high up or low down. Now, I just made a bunch of dots and said some things. So let's break that up a little bit. So with a 1 point, what you want to have is that means you have a vanishing point. So when I'm talking about points, it's all of your vanishing points. Now, we want to start with a horizon line. And so that is your eye line. That is your camera line is where our horizon line is. So that is wherever your camera is placed and is looking straight ahead. So that's the flattest point. So our vanishing point is going to be on that horizon line. So if we have 1 point, it means that everything that goes into the distance is going to be radiating out from that 1 point. And it looks like spokes on a bicycle wheel. Now, these lines have a name. They're called orthogonal lines. Orthogonal. You don't necessarily need to know those names, but I always find it's really helpful when you do know the terminology because then it becomes really easy to be really clear whenever you're asking about something. So these orthogonal lines are all going to be pointing towards that vanishing point. And anything that you are going to be placing here, its depth as it goes back and it recedes will go to that vanishing point. So the easiest way to practice is to just use your basic shapes. So if I want to put a square on this 1 point, then I have these visible edges, and the visible edges are going to be going towards that vanishing point. And then because it's 1 point, there's no other distortion that's happening here. This this line that goes inward, that's going to be our back surface. That's just going to be parallel with here, our front line. And the same thing can be said for the bottom and the top. And if you need to make something that's 3 dimensional and you're wondering, okay, well, how do I know where that should go? So take every point, and all of those points are going to go to that vanishing. And so when you do that, you now know that wherever these horizontal lines are, wherever they intersect, that's going to be where your line needs to be. Then you can draw down from there. And then you have your line that completes your full object, and it allows you to now have something that's in 3 dimension. And honestly, the great thing to practice is to just start dropping really boxes. You'll find that in drawing, a lot of times the most simple shapes are the easiest. Boxes, spheres, cylinders, can't go wrong with them. Those are the best things to like start with. So go with those. So if I want all these little boxes here, then I'm just going to follow my orthogonals and take them to the vanishing point. And you can make them as ridiculously long or as short as you want, because this is all just in the name of practice and getting your head sort of wrapped around this 3 dimensional space that is really just a flat piece of paper. So now that we have this kind of idea, we're now understanding how the 1 point works. How does the 2 point work? Because we are going to have, actually, I'll switch colors so it's a little easier to see. So we're going to still have our horizon line. Our horizon line will always be a constant. It may shift its location, but it will always be here as well, just like the vanishing points and just like your orthogonals. So I've got my horizon line. My 2 point are going to be obviously 2 vanishing points, but they're going to be on far ends of the spectrum on your x-axis. So you have your left-hand side vanishing point, and then you're going to have your far right-hand side vanishing point. And the same thing that you did here for number 1, when you have orthogonals going out like a bike spoke, it's going to be the same thing. Except for it's just going to, just going to go further out. And now you go from the other side and you're going to start intersecting and crossing those orthogonals. But what that now is giving us is it's giving us a much deeper field to work from. So now instead of having something that is super flat, I can now start to rotate items. And so once you start understanding the 2 point perspective, that's when you can start rotating these 3D models in your head. So, like we did here, having these pieces that went into depth towards the vanishing point, I'm just going to do the same thing, but essentially I'm going to be establishing my shape in that perspective. And then I'll do the same thing. I'll follow the orthogonals to the opposite vanishing point. So now I have a box. Because it's on my horizon line, you're not going to see the top or the bottom, but you're going to now see 2 sides. And so 2 point, 2 sides. And the cool thing is you can then start to shift and change the depth of everything. So if I want to have a short rectangle, like it's shallow this way, I can make it deeper this way. And just like here, because it's above the horizon line, I'm going to see below it. So you're going to see the base. And the same is also true if I were to, or I guess the same is true in an opposite sense. If I drop below my horizon line, then that means I'm going to see the top of my object. Remember that your horizon line is where your eye is. So it's the middle of your eye line. So if you, and that's, it gets kind of confusing when you say the eye line because you automatically want to think that it's like standard height, it's average height. But that's not necessarily true because your eye line changes if you stand up on a ladder and you're looking for directly forward, you don't have your head turned upwards or turned downwards, and you're looking straight forward, your eye line is now much higher. So your horizon line is way higher. So there's a lot that goes underneath and that like is below you, below that horizon line. Now the same can be said if I squat down or if I'm laying on my belly on the ground and I look up. Now my horizon line is, well, it's really really low down there, and there's a ton of space that goes ahead of me or goes above me. So your line, your horizon line, your eye line is always going to change, and that is something that's super important when you start thinking about camera angles for your shots for comics. Now this kind of pulls into doing your 3-point perspective, because this is when you really start to get to play with the most amount of depth. And if I can find a way to throw 3-point perspective into most of my larger scenes, I will, even if it's like really slight. So I'm going to have my horizon line again as a full constant. So I'll have my left and my right. And if I want to have, let's see, how would I do? I'll do a low horizon line or a low third vanishing point since I've got all this stuff up here. So rinse and repeat what we've done with our orthogonals. So I'm going to do the same thing that I always do. What's important when you have a 3-point like this is you want to make sure that your orthogonals are going to reach your third point, because it's going to help you with your perspective grid when you add that third point. So now I have orthogonals coming from my left. I now have some orthogonals coming from my right. And now here's the 3-point, having some orthogonals coming from my base. So now I have 3 points, and this is where it gets really fun. So if I have a vanishing point that is really far down, so below my horizon line, then this means that my camera angle is very high up. The opposite is also true. If my third point is above my horizon line, that means my camera is very low. It starts to get really confusing when you use it in these terms. I promise you, the more you do it, the more it makes sense and the less you really have to think about it. Because you'll also just start noticing it. You'll start seeing it a ton and you'll be like, okay, yeah, I'm actually seeing the three perspective points. I'm seeing the vanishing point in real time because I'm low and I'm looking up at a building and I'm seeing everything converging to a point. That's how you start to see those things in real life. So the opposite is also true. If I'm standing up on a roof and I'm looking down, I'm starting to see all of those lines starting to converge towards the bottom. And so if I think of it that way, so say if I am going to do a roof line or something, let's say this is the corner of a building and I'm maybe standing on an adjacent building. Then I want to have, here's my roof base, and my vertical lines are going to follow this third horizon point, because my horizontal lines have been following to these vanishing points on my side on my horizon line. Now the one that breaks is my lower vanishing, my third point. Now that's going to go down. Same with the sides. And then wherever I want it to end, need to have that finish off there. And obviously, if I'm going to have like windows and things like that, they're going to follow the exact same procedure. Now, something that is really important to remember whenever you start getting into the 3 point perspective, especially, is this third point needs to be pretty far down for just lack of space on this small piece of paper. I put them all pretty close together, but you can tell that this looks like a very like forced perspective, weird shot. And it is because I'm pushing how sharp that angle is. Like this should be a smaller building so it doesn't look so distorted, because when you have your vanishing points too close together, and your picture, like your drawing, your scene, whatever, starts to get really close to those vanishing points, you have to be very careful because you start getting a lot of very strange distortion that happens the closer you get to those vanishing points. So it is really important to know that your vanishing points are going to be very far apart from, like, for the most part. Um the closer they are together, like I said, the more skewed everything is going to start to look. And it does work if you are going for more of like a fisheye or a more strange look. That does work, but generally speaking, like if I'm gonna really do sort of one of these, I'm gonna have my vanishing point like way, way, way down, because a lot of times your three vanishing points, or like your third one for 3 point perspective, does tend to like not look super great when you exaggerate it. So having that subtlety is actually pretty good to have. And a lot does actually go a long way, because while it may look pretty shallow up here, as your orthogonals go down, they start to really get super steep. So, if I really wanted to do that building again, maybe I would do it more in line with something like this. So that it doesn't look so, this looks very squashed and strange. This looks a little bit more normal. When you start to then add other pieces around it, even adding like a sidewalk. So though it may still look pinched, and though it still looks a little bit distorted, this feels a little bit better. This feels a little bit more like what we're feeling like it should look like. And then obviously, let's see, add more streets, and then it's even fun because if you want to add like street lamps, just follow that perspective. So then that's how you can kind of make a little bit more of a scene. And again, that third point adds so much character. I always have a really good time if I can just maybe even throw in a little bit of a 3 point perspective. That's really fun to get into. Um, I just think it adds quite a bit. So I want to now, moving from this kind of idea, the 3 points, important, very important. I want to move on to like what they are sort of in context, like how do you use them really well. But specifically, I want to talk about lighting, because I really like doing really dramatic light. And so I want to just do a real quick like showcase on how you use perspective to help with your lighting. So if I have an object that I need to like cast a shadow, say I have so say I have this like character right here. Let me go ahead and darken it. And so if I need to have a shadow cast, so say I want to cast a shadow coming at us a little bit, like a cast shadow. So I need to understand where my light source is, and I need to establish that. So if I establish that my light source is right here, my light source is now my 1 point perspective. So this is my vanishing point. And what you need to know also is what is the ground plane. So if I have this grid shape here, that means I now know my ground plane. So with this being my light source, there's my da 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 da. I want to throw my orthogonal lines away from here. So now that I have this idea, I now know where everything needs to be. So I can actually take these points and measure them out because I know that this goes out like this. It's basically like making a triangle. I can pull this shoulder and know that's where that shoulder needs to be. I can pull this hand and that's where that hand needs to be. So I can connect those together. Right here, this little gap. Okay, then I follow that down. Great, that's where that gap needs to be. Bottom of the hand, right here. Same thing goes for the foot. Okay, the outside of the foot, right there. Inside of the foot, boom, right there. Go together. Then these connect. Same thing. Gap right here. Go from the spot where here in the middle. Okay. Go up. These follow. Foot. Foot. Let's get the hand right here. Okay. Okay. Now I know this goes here. Literally making this the entire paper. Didn't realize how large this was going to be. But anyway, this is the essentially the concept is wherever your light source is, you're essentially making like a triangle. So if you have your subject here and you have your light here, Here's your ground plane. That's going to be your shadow. So it's definitely really interesting that you can do that. And it can be really helpful for um, when you have objects. So if I have a, say, a wall right here, and let's say I have an object on this wall, and I have my light source shining from up here, and I need to cast a shadow of this object onto this wall. Well, I will know that this is my point of contact. This is where my object is actually touching the wall. So if I have light that's coming down like this, I know that this is my flat surface, then I'm going to have a point here. This will follow here, here. So that's giving my nice long shadow coming away from it. And obviously, like the further your light source, the more intensely drawn out and dragged out your shadow will be. So like if you have a character is right here and his light source is pretty far away, then you're gonna have a nice long shadow. If you have a character and the light source is really close, it's funny because you won't have a long shadow, but you will have a very big shadow. Because that body is blocking so much of that light. So it's really interesting how you can use perspective in the sense of lighting. Now, moving on to this idea of like quick perspective, I want to use just sort of an example, like doing some panels, because something that always kind of irks me is really flat panels. So let's say panel perspective. So when you're doing like perspective in panels, this is a little bit of a shorthand, and I don't mean this in a sense of like, hey, you can go ahead and skip learning perspective because there's nothing that's going to replace learning perspective. But they're like being able to know it is really important. But sometimes you don't have the opportunity to sit there and measure out a super wide and super long vanishing point perspective grid. And so when that happens, a lot of times I tend to lean in the side of more what's it called, a relative perspective as opposed to technical perspective. And I'll show you a little bit what that means. Let me sharpen that up real quick. It's just basically using your eye to basically say like, hey, does this look right? And then the other thing too is whenever you're drawing, say, is anything being super distorted? So I still want to make sure that I have my horizon line. So like I said, that's your eye line. That's always going to be a constant, is having your horizon line. Now, the thing is, my vanishing points may be like, they may need to be like, not even just like off the page here, but like way off the page. So, what I like to do is find an approximate area that I would need them to be at and just kind of slowly give myself a loose grid. Now, again, that's not by any means a technical or technically correct way to measure this out, but this is giving me a good visual to understand these are where my relative vanishing points need to be. Now, what I can do is, I can move my vanishing point a little bit closer so that this one is much further away. My far left is really far away. My right one could be a little bit closer. So I can establish that I want this right side to be just a little bit closer. So now I have a much more interesting panel grid that I can work off of. And this is when it becomes really important to guess and check whenever you are making your scene to say like, hey, is something looking super weird? So just start building out your scene and make sure that you're making sure that nothing looks too terribly wonky and weird. So let's just say that throwing a pencil. All right, so I decided to make this sort of a cubicle office space. A little office tree here in the corner. Some overhead lights. We'll say that this is boss's cubicle. We'll give him a window. Some blinds in it. Give that a little curve, like a little voussoir arch, because right here, I instead of it being a warp, I was running the risk of making a tangent, and so I don't want that. So I'm gonna change it so that we have ourselves like a little archway. And you see what I was talking about with warping is I have to be careful over here because these are starting to squash a little bit in a weird way, and so um, part of that is me adding some random, bits and bobs, odds and ends over here so that it covers it up and it doesn't become so apparent that there's a little bit of a warp that can happen right there. So I don't want that. But if I'm stuck with this shot, that is one way that you can kind of help to alleviate some of the weird look. Add another cubicle wall right here. And more lights. We'll add a rug. Maybe a little table with some magazines on it. And so this way, you've now made a much more, or at least I should say, a much more interesting looking scene. And now you could light it however you want. Even if you're toning it, just have the exterior. Maybe this is all. It's another arch right there. So maybe this is all dark, and then it gets really light back down here. I mean, obviously, this is where your staging and your environment, all those pieces of designs, where they all come into play. But you now have a much more interesting layout on your hands because you have this sort of relative perspective going here. This really will really help you out whenever you're trying to just come up with blocking with concept art, really quick concept art, coming up with different layouts for locations. I mean, you can push it as well if you want to do a 3-point perspective. So just like we did before, although how about this time we do a low horizon line, drop my little quick grid in here. Same thing. And now I have very intense orthogonals. And let me throw my third point. So now I've got 3 points. Now this is where you can kind of have fun really just doing whatever. So let's say, and I mean, it works too. Like, it doesn't have to be, I think we tend to look at perspective of, like it has to be buildings and it has to be these structures and things like that. But that's not exactly necessarily true. It can actually be nature. So I want to use this perspective and I want to make sort of more of a nature scene. That's great. We just need to block it out with our basic shapes. So let me like have of a character in this scale, so I at least know, like, I know the size that I want to work with. So let's say that's my character's scale size. All right. Well, let's start going from there. Let's use some blocking out techniques to make some big old boulders. And maybe pull in another archway. Again, using that perspective, because if we're going to see the bottom side of it, we need to make sure that we have it all mapped out and blocked out. All right, so now that you have all this stuff blocked out, we've looked at the basic, shapes of the whole thing. Now you can just go back in and start to kind of rough everything up, make it look more textural, make it look the way you want it to, at least like rock wise. Have a little overhang of grass or something. And once again, this is where blocking everything out with basic shapes is going to be super valuable, because when you want to go to render everything, you have your 3 dimension is already in mind. So you don't have to think about it nearly as much. You already know how the shapes are supposed to look because you've already blocked them out. it is always interesting to me how a lot of times our brain wants to overcomplicate, uh, like, like rocks and, pieces of environment. We want to overcomplicate it because, I mean, it may be detailed, but there's a lot of times that our brain it's like we're picking up on not necessarily just the overall structure of what it is we're looking at, but we're also absorbing all of the other pieces of sensory input. Like we're thinking of the tactile texture, and we're thinking of all the pits, and we're thinking of what does it feel like on top of what does it look like. So it's like in reality, it's a very simple structure, but it feels really complicated and complex because we're seeing so much little pitting, and we're seeing all these little um, cracks and things that look like plane changes. And so our brain says like, hey, that is an extremely complicated thing. But like if you're gonna draw it, if you can train your eye and train your mind to sort of dumb it down. Look at its most basic form. What are the most obvious and clearest things that are sticking out? What are the things that are the most major that I need to pay attention to? And those major things are like plane changes, overall shadow shapes. How is the change in depth? Like those the things that you really, really need to pay attention to, because everything else can kind of come and go. And honestly, the other big thing is that at a distance, that's the best way to look at these things, because at a distance you lose a lot of that clarity. So you're going to lose the clarity of all that, um, that what you would call haptic texture, the feeling, the tactile feeling that you would get. You're going to lose a lot of that, and that's a lot of times why, like if you're if you're in art school, or if you've ever had an art teacher that has said like, hey, you need to like take a step back and squint. Well, that's exactly what that is doing. It's eliminating a lot of that extraneous information from your head, so all you're seeing is the most uh basic portions, the most intense contrasts, and all of the things that are the most really important for your brain to pick up on in order for it to know that, hey, this is this is what this object is. And I think that that's really interesting. I think it's really cool. And I think that's part of the fun of drawing and trying to understand stylization. Like, how do I stylize this? Like, well, that's a great question because it's super detailed. So there could be an infinite way, like infinite ways to style it. It's now up to you to figure out what are the things that are the most important, and what are the things that stick out to you that you want the viewer to pick up on. Like I know for me, I want them to pick up on maybe the heaviness. So for me, I would use texture and a lot of these big, chunky, heavy shadows, because the chunky, heavy shadows are going to really feel heavy. They're going to feel oppressive, and that's what I really want. I want my viewer picking up on that. I want them to feel the weight of the rocks that they're surrounded by, and with the texturing and things, I want them to feel the grit of, the sandstone or whatever it is that I have. I want that to be front and center, because that's the kind of artist I am, and I want them to feel that. I like being able to make drawings that you can look at and you can almost feel, and texture does that. And so that's how, even for just doing a rock formation, this is how you incorporate using this perspective. Even if it's not technical perspective, this is just optical perspective or relative perspective. Even if you're just adding those things and you're piecing them together, it's going to pay off immensely. And really being able to do this in the panel is going to help especially when you're rotating your characters and you have your environments, it's going to make your environments feel richer because you're able to drop down a quick perspective grid and you're able to then fill everything in because you've got guidelines in place and you're not just guessing. And whenever you throw those guides in, you can then start to build your environment, throw your characters in, or throw your characters in, know the perspective that they're in, whatever angle they're at, and then start to allow your environment around it to respond to those things. So if I was going to try and do that, just as a real quick, maybe one last example. All right, so if I am going to, I'm going to make a like a barbarian. Make an old man barbarian. So if I have this character at this angle, right? So I'm pushing this angle similar to this. I'm pushing sort of more of a 3 point. So I know that this guy is going to be, he's definitely pushing a 3 point perspective. And I'm going to go ahead and draw that in. So now I know all of my verticals. So I know where my vertical lines need to go. And so if I have this guy, that doesn't show up super well. Then I will just use a pen. So if I have this guy, So now he's clear. So if I have these lines, obviously, like I said, we have our exaggerated third point. Now we need to drop in two more perspective points so that we can fill in our background if we need to. So if I'm looking up at this guy, that means what? Go back to what we said before. If I'm looking up, that means my camera is low. So I need to have a low horizon line that's way off of the page. So I'm gonna say maybe it's a little bit above the bottom of the page. So let's say that that's what we're going with. So I'm gonna then drop in my perspective grid like that. Same thing on this side. And so now I have a perspective grid that matches this character. So when I do that, now I can just start adding, maybe I want there to be a doorway right here. It's low. I'll see the bottom of it. Maybe that's part of a hallway. Maybe we've got some big exposed timbers. So then you can go in. And so say that these are big roof timbers. Darken all this. Maybe have some just random ropes and things like that. But again, the ropes are actually going to follow the perspective as well because they're following gravity, and we've established our gravity to be a little different because we've got a warped perspective going on here. But see, then you have all of these things, and okay, darken parts of the hallway or darken parts of the room around him, and say that there's a big, light source coming from here. So now we've got darkness from above him and from the side of him. Or I guess light coming from above and the side. There you go. Now you have like a whole completely like different looking scene. If you just had him standing there, yeah, sure, that's imposing, as an isolated shot. But because you know how to pull those perspective lines to match your character, you then now can then put them in the context of a scene, and you can make the illustration for that panel much more interesting, way cooler, and then also just like cinematically speaking, way more intense. Like it's got more depth, it's got more lighting. There's more you can do with it. There's so much more. It's just more. And it's a very simple thing to do is to just understand where is your character? How do I throw a grid around my character in order to give me some guidelines to know where I'm supposed to put everything. Once you do that and once you figure that out, then you can do it with every panel to make sure that you're placing your characters in their scene so you're never lost. And that's something that I found a lot with my students is they wouldn't do that. And so I would constantly find myself asking them like, I don't know where I am. Like there's a lot of white backgrounds and I don't it's not that I see something is happening, but I don't know if they're moving. I don't know if they have to go somewhere. I don't know if they've changed positions between each other because there's just a lot of things happening, but there's not a lot of information that's being given to me about what's happening. So being able to draw a background, being able to place that figure in that background because you know how to play with this perspective is super, super important. So I just wanted to go over that just as a few things and showing some examples how to do it in context of panels. So it's not just the idea and understanding, like I said at the very beginning with my students, they understood the concept of perspective, the 1 point, the 2 point, and the 3 point. It's just the application that they were having trouble with. And so I wanted to give you a few little applications so you could actually see how all of this plays out and how it all plays together. So anyway, I hope that was super helpful. I hope you enjoyed sort of that walk through, that lesson, that little it's like a little mini deep dive into perspective and stuff like that. So I appreciate it. I thank you guys. I hope you enjoyed watching it again and get out there, go make some great comics. So thanks, everybody.